Namo Bhagavate Shri Ramanaya. Welcome to our guest today, David Godman ji, and he kindly accepted our invitation to join us for Melbourne Bhagwan Satsang group. And as I spoke to him a week ago, and I told him that people want to ask him some questions. So he asked me if they have any questions, I can send him a list. Now that list has become gigantic. It's really big. We initially thought we might start with a discussion and some introduction, and then I can introduce him to others, and then he can start with questions. But looking like the list is so long that probably the satsang might exceed more than an hour. So I believe people will enjoy a longer satsang. I think nobody is in a rush to finish it. Now, I just want to, rather than being in between you and David Godman, I would like to just tell people about David Godman who don't really know who he is, but I believe everyone knows him very well. So David Godman is an ardent devotee of Bhagwan Sri Ramana Maharishi, who has spent more than 40 years studying and practicing Bhagwan's teachings. Mostly he has stayed in Tirunamalai during this time. He has written extensively on Bhagwan, his devotees, his teachings, and through YouTube channels, videos, which I really loved. I have not missed even one single of his videos and his books. And then he has also has a dedicated website. So there's a lot of information on Bhagwan and his devotees and his teachings on David Godman's website, in his books and YouTube videos. So I would like David Godman to pick up the questions what I have sent to him. Last time when I spoke to him about this meeting, the conversation went for more than an hour, and whatever was coming between us, and I was asking and he was telling me, and we were discussing things, because whatever you talk about Bhagwan, you always love to talk about him, you know, because he's everyone's guru. It's and that's why we are all here gathered together to reflect on his things. So it's all with you now, David. Look, David Godman has changed from man to woman.
Where am I?
Yes.
Oh, good. I'm moving again. Sorry, that was just temporary hiccup. So I will carry on. Nice to see you all. Great to have the opportunity to talk about Bhagavan, his teachings. I was sent a list of questions. It was a bit like a buffet this morning. I had to look at them. You go down and you think maybe this one, maybe that one. But then like you often have at buffets, I got to one item and I thought, wow, that's it. I'm piling my plate with that. Sorry, everything else I'll have to miss out on today. So the one thing I really wanted to talk about, the one question that jumped off the page, was one that said, Sri Lakshmana Swami attained self-realization by reciting Hari Ramana relentlessly. Has David come across any other account of anyone using this or any other Bhagavan-related mantra to realize the self? What are his views on meditating on the mantra in modern times? First of all, I should say I don't really have many views of my own. I'm happy to pass on what I've learned on this topic from Bhagavan and from the many devotees I know who've engaged in intensive japa mantra chanting. To give some context to this, I should give a quick summary of what Lakshmana Swami actually did and how he realized the self. When he was a teenager, he had a direct experience of the self by doing pranayama, couldn't get it back and realized he needed a guru to help him finish off what the experience had first given to him. He went to see Bhagavan during the Kumbhabhishekam of the Mother's Temple in March 1949. Didn't get a chance to talk to him because it was very crowded. At that point, he decided Bhagavan was his guru and changed his pre-existing japa from Hari Ram to Hari Ramana. So he decided he would go off and do very intensive practice by himself to see what progress he could make chanting the name of his guru. He ended up on a hut on a beach in southern Andhra Pradesh, had several outstanding experiences. He had read about self-inquiry during his visit to Ramanashram, but it wasn't a practice that particularly appealed to him. But he did say that as he was doing his japa on the beach, when he got absolutely silent from reciting his guru's name, very occasionally the mind would sink back into the self and he'd have a direct experience, just temporary and brief experience of the self. After about 6 months, we're up to now October 1949, he turned up at Ramanashram again. Again, it was a busy festival time. He didn't know this was the Navaratri celebrations. And Vijayadashmi, the biggest day of the festival, he ended up sitting down outside the new hall at Ramanashram. He didn't want to go in because it was a bit noisy, chaotic. Everyone was bustling around. So he found a quiet spot outside, sat down with his back to a pillar on the walkway around the new hall, started doing his japa, and then he said it stopped. He said his mind went back into his heart, the heart on the right side of the chest, and there he saw a smiling picture of Ramana Maharshi in the heart center. And he said spontaneously, the question, "Who am I?" appeared inside him. And as an answer to that question, that the mind, the I thought, went back into the self, the heart, and died. And he said, from that moment on, the I thought never functioned or arose in me again. So this is a very spectacular instance of a devotee getting it very quickly. What he did do for a long time was japa of his guru's name, but I would more tend to say that the immediate cause of his liberation was Bhagavan's proximity, his maturity, his readiness, and the spontaneous asking of the question, "Who am I?" which caused his I to go back into the self and disappear. I think that Bhagavan knew that he was ready for this. This wasn't some surprise to anybody there. In those days, Bhagavan used to live in the Nirvana room opposite the new hall entrance. He walked from there about 3 o'clock in the afternoon for the afternoon session. Lakshmana Swami said that they stopped, briefly looked at each other, namaste to each other. And I think Bhagavan knew this is a super ripe devotee. He's a fruit about to fall off the tree. So when he sat down with his back to the pillar, he motioned to Muruggana, who was sitting next to him, "Go over there, that boy outside, go and sit next to him, look after him, be his minder for the day." So I think something in Bhagavan knew this was somebody who was ready to get the final experience. Up till then, he'd done japa, but in Bhagavan's presence, his sanidhi, through the inquiry, he got it. I would say, and I'm going to develop this theme later, that the japa was something that purified his mind, it emptied his mind to the point where he was ready to receive the fullness of Bhagavan's grace and to realize the self in his presence. But I don't think the japa or the mantra of its own accord would have done it. He needed that personal one-to-one with Bhagavan. He needed that inquiry, "Who am I?" to happen. And he needed his I to go back into the self in Bhagavan's presence. There is another famous instance of a devotee actually asking Bhagavan about this. What kind of mantra, or why are my mantras not working? This was Ganapati Muni, who came to Bhagavan in 1907 in a burst of devotional fervor, and feeling a little disappointed with his lack of progress. He was a famous Pandit scholar, he had devotees of his own, but he realized that he wasn't really getting the experiences that he hoped for. And he'd heard about Bhagavan on the hill and went to see him, humbled himself before Bhagavan and said, "I've performed millions and millions of japas of all the famous mantras, but I've not realized the self." is my tapas tainted? I like this phrase. It's a very Ganapati Muni-ish phrase. Bhagavan didn't make a comment initially on his mantra chanting. Bhagavan just said, if you observe that from which the I rises in you, the mind will subside there. That is true tapas. So Bhagavan wasn't recommending him to do mantras. He was saying, look inside yourself, see where the I rises, subside into that place, and that's true tapas. Ganapati Muni at that point wasn't really interested in doing inquiry or following his eye. He was very much bound up in his mantra japa. So he came back with the question, can I get the same result if I do mantra japa as well? This is very typical Bhagavan. If you asked him a question, he would tell you to do self-inquiry. If you didn't like the answer, he'd ascertain what you were actually doing. And then he'd say, okay, if this is working for you, if this is what you want to do, then you can do that. But the answer had a kind of twist in it. Instead of merely endorsing what Ganapati Muni was doing, he said, if while you're doing the japa, you observe inside yourself where the sound of the mantra is coming from, the mind will subside there. That is tapas. So what Bhagavan is saying, it's not the mantra itself, it's not the crores of repetitions that produce the result, it's finding that place inside yourself where the mantra arises, going back to that place, going back through the I thought, back into the self, and finding out the source of the sound, the source of the mantra. So again, Bhagavan is saying, no, mantras will not get you liberated. What gets you liberated is having the I thought, go back to its source and disappear. Part of the question, where are we? A Bhagavan using this or any other Bhagavan related mantra. Now, I like the phrase Bhagavan related mantra. He did very rarely give out mantras. I only know of 3 instances where he gave them out to devotees in response to requests. And those 3 that I know about are Namale Swami, Muruggana, and an unknown outcast devotee who came to the ashram fence with some trepidation, didn't want to come in, but asked for a mantra, and Bhagavan gave him one. In all 3 cases, the mantra that Bhagavan gave out was Shiva Shiva. Now this is interesting. Bhagavan never ever suggested that anyone repeat his own name, although there were many devotees who were repeating Bhagavan's name as a japa or incorporating it into some form of mantra. He had no objection to that if they told him that's what they were doing. But if you put him on the spot and said, please give me a mantra, and you persuaded him to give you an answer, the thing he was most likely to say was, okay, if you really want one, chant Shiva Shiva. The one Bhagavan related mantra he did recommend is not a classic name of God, it's the word I. On several occasions, he said that the repetition of the word I could lead to liberation. He also said it was the most accurate and most powerful name of God, and that repeating it with attention on the I, on the name of God that you're repeating, will take you back to the self. So I this morning I went back to my copy of Guru Vachika Kovai, and I'll just read you a few verses in which Bhagavan is very, very positively endorsing the repetition of the word I, and saying that it has the potential to take you back to the self when used as a mantra. This is a sequence that starts at 712. When the reality that is known as the heart gradually emerges from the heart and expands as consciousness, it takes many thousands of names. On investigation, the foremost of these will found to be I. The aforementioned I takes the foremost position amongst the innumerable names of God. Since it exists along with Am in everyone's heart, as the ever-present self-experience as I am, the revelation of beingness, the true import of that I, that name Am, also attains the foremost place. God, the transcendental being, resides in the heart as I, the Atma Swarupa, as mere being free of thought. Amongst the many thousands of divine names given to him in the many different religions and languages, no other name is so perfectly apt and has such true elegance as this name Am. For those whose attention is focused on the self, only the name Aham Aham, I, among the many known names of God, will constantly reverberate in the heart firmament once the ego has been destroyed, and it will remain there center stage as the silent transcendental speech, Mauna Paravac. Even if you do nothing more than unceasingly think of that first name I, with the attention focused on that I sense, that practice will take you to the source from where rises the illusory thought I, which is the embryo of the ego that connects you to the body. So this is Bhagavan giving a massive endorsement to not merely holding on to the I, but actually repeating it, holding on to the sense of I as you repeat it and allowing the I to go back to his source. There is another text that Bhagavan enjoyed on the repetition of I, and that was taken from Namdev's Philosophy of the Divine Name, in which Namdev is saying something which is extraordinarily close to what Bhagavan taught all his life. So I have two of those verses here as well. And Namdev says, the all-pervading nature of the name of God can only be understood when one recognizes one's own I. When one's own name is not recognized, it is impossible to get the all-pervading name. None can realize the name of God by practice of knowledge, meditation, or austerity. Surrender yourself first at the feet of the Guru and learn to know that I myself is that name. After finding the source of that I, merge your individuality in that oneness, which is self-existent and devoid of all duality. You can't get closer to Bhagavan than that. I'm going to come back to a portion of what Namdev said later, but back first to the original question that was framed, do I know of anyone who has followed this path and realized the self? Well, no, I don't. All I do know is that Bhagavan recommended repetition of I as the most powerful name of God, as a mantra to repeat it. In Day by Day with Bhagavan, there was a woman who came to him. Bhagavan recommended conventional self-inquiry. She said she found it too hard, difficult to do. So he said, well, instead just chant I, repeat the name of I as japa, as mantra, and that would take you to the same source. My feeling on reading that was that it was a kind of slightly inferior substitute, in Bhagavan's opinion, to doing self-inquiry in the traditional way. But if you look at who am I, if you look at the text Nanya, Bhagavan says there quite clearly, quite explicitly, that repeating the word I will take you back to the self. There are no qualifications there. There's nothing that says if you can't do self-inquiry in the traditional prescribed way, then as a slightly inferior method, repeat the word I. It's a very simple declarative statement that repeating the word I will take you back to the source. There is a verse in Ulladu Narpadu which is quite complicated and hinges on some very obscure Tamil grammar to get the right meaning out of it. But I'd like to read it out to you because I think it gives a really elegant summary on Bhagavan's teachings on japa, mantra, what you can get from them and what you can't get from them. It's verse 8. And it's talking about devotees who worship God in name and form. And it says, whatever name they give to it, in whatever form they worship it, that constitutes a way of knowing reality in name and form. Nevertheless, you should know that the only true knowing is to discern one's own truth in the truth of that supreme reality, to subside into it and to emerge as one with it. Now, this is a bit complicated, but the first half of the verse is saying, if you repeat God's name, if you worship his form, then you can have a dualistic experience of God. You can have a vision, you can have the bliss, but it doesn't take you beyond name and form. What he says is that you know reality in name and form. Then the second half of the verse says the only true way to find reality is to subside into it and merge as one with it. So the two halves of the verse, the first one says that if you are chanting a mantra, if you're doing japa, if you're worshipping form, then yes, you can get the bliss, yes, you can get the mediated vision, but you're not going to get the full and complete reality of the self, which you get from subsiding into the formless self. There are I will say there are two possible ways of interpreting, translating this verse. I've picked one of them because it happens to agree with my thesis in this particular answer, but I've seen other occasions when Bhagavan said the same thing. There's a verse in Guru Vajka Kovai which makes the same distinction. So I'm fairly confident that the explanation I'm giving you here is the one that Bhagavan intended, that name and form meditation can take you to a certain point in which you can have your bliss, you can have your visions, but until you allow the I which has the vision to go back to its source and disappear, you're not going to get the full formless, unmediated experience of the self. So this leads me on to another classic mantra, japa, chanting devotee of Bhagavan, and that's Papaji. So he is the classic illustration and example of what I've just been talking about. For those of you who don't know his story, he had a direct experience of the self when he was a young boy, maybe 6 or 7 years old. He was in Lahore at a family gathering, and he was lifting a mango juice to his mouth to have a drink. Halfway between the table and his mouth, he got completely paralyzed. He had a direct experience of the self. He couldn't be shaken or woken out of it. He was in it for about 3 days. And then when he finally recovered normal consciousness, he of course didn't know what it was, but he wanted it back. And his mother convinced him, his mother was a Krishna Bhakta, she convinced him that this was some kind of visitation from Krishna, and if he wanted the experience back again, then he had to take up serious Krishna practices to get the bliss and the experience of Krishna back. He followed his mother's advice, and very soon after that, he was playing with a visionary Krishna. He could summon up a Krishna in his bedroom. He could spend his evenings playing with the Krishna who showed up in his bedroom. I spoke to his sisters in the 1990s, and that they remember him jumping around when he was a boy, playing with this Krishna in his bedroom. In later life, he became a full-on Krishna gopi. He would dress up in saris. He would spend his salaries on jewelry to adorn himself. He would spend the whole night dancing in bliss with Krishna. He became addicted to the form, so much so that he would get depressed when he couldn't make Krishna appear. What he was looking for in those days was a guaranteed way of getting his form of God, his chosen deity, to appear before him whenever he wanted it. So he went on a pilgrimage all over India to all the famous gurus, and his question was, can you show me God? If you can, do it. If not, I'm going somewhere else. He wasn't interested in sitting down, practicing. He wanted instant results. Do it now or I'm going somewhere else. Of course, nobody could do that for him. He ended up back in his house in Punjab, heard about Bhagavan, came to Tiruvannamalai and asked the same question, can you show me God? And Bhagavan, of course, he wasn't a great believer in visions. He said to him, you yourself are God. God is the seer, he's not the seen. I can't show you God because you yourself are God. The seer is God. Papaji had a quite remarkable experience of the self, as Bhagavan said this, but it didn't shake him of his conviction that the goal in life, for him at least, was to see Krishna in form. So he went back to Madras, Chennai as it now is, and redoubled his efforts. This is where the mantras come in. He'd been doing mantras all his life, but he used to get up every morning at 2 a.m. and start a regime that involved 50,000 repetitions of Krishna's name. He was coordinating them, synchronizing them with his breath, and he realized, or rather he calculated, how many breaths he'd taken during his lifetime, and came to the conclusion that every breath he'd ever taken that he hadn't said the name of Krishna had been a wasted breath. So his goal was to account for every single breath he'd had during his whole life and make sure that he had at least one repetition of God's name to account for every breath he'd ever taken. So this went on. He locked himself in his puja room. He told his wife never to disturb him. He'd get up, have his breakfast, walk to the office, chanting his Krishna. If nobody needed to talk to him at work, he'd be chanting his mantra all day. So this incredibly intense practice resulted, somewhat surprisingly, in a visitation to his Madras house of Ram, Sita, Hanuman, and Lakshman. He heard a knock on his door in the middle of the night. He opened the door, and the 4 gods were out there. And he was a bit surprised. They weren't his gods, but he invited them in. And Ram addressed him and said, Hanuman came to tell us what a great devotee you are. He advised us to come down and sit with you for a while. So that they spent the night together. Papaji said he was in complete bliss for the whole night. But when they vanished in the morning, he said he lost his ability to even think about Krishna. He said, my mind refused to engage in any japa, any mantra. He said, I've been doing this 50,000 times a day. My whole life revolved around getting my quota of mantras out every day. And he said, it was physically impossible for me to say the name Krishna once or to repeat my mantra. He said, I thought I'd lost my devotion. I thought something had gone wrong with my brain, my mind. I didn't know what to do. But then I remembered the Swami in Tiruvannamalai. I remembered Ramana Maharshi. And he said, even though he discouraged me from an interest in visions, I had a really outstanding experience while I was there. He took my mind back into the heart. He showed me the heart. So I didn't like his advice, but I definitely recognized his power. And I want an expert. I want somebody who has some experience of these matters to give me good advice. So I actually talked to him in Lucknow. I said, you weren't very impressed the first time you went, but then in Madras, you suddenly decided he was an authority figure whom you could trust. What happened in the intervening time? And he said, oh, I forgot to tell you. I went back once more after that first visit, and I saw a family who had gone from Madurai to Tirupati and then come back via Tiruvannamalai. And they were showing an image of Krishna to Bhagavan, and he'd taken it, he was looking at it, admiring it. And he said, I looked at Bhagavan's face as he was admiring this image. And he said, I had been doing Krishna mantras all my life. I can recognize love and devotion in a fellow devotee's eyes. I looked at the way that Bhagavan looked at this image, and I could just see that he was full of bhakti towards this image. So he said, at that point, my skepticism vanished. I thought he's a secret Krishna bhakti. He doesn't want to tell anyone, but I recognize it in his eyes when he looked at this image. So having lost his ability to even say the name of God once, he thought that this is the man who can tell me what's happened and what I should do next. So he had a job in Chennai working in a civilian branch of the British Army. On his next weekend leave, he got on the train, went to Tiruvannamalai, and has my book gone? I'll read this out because I can't do justice to it myself by retelling it. I will tell you in his own words. I sat in front of the Maharshi and began to tell him my story. I said, for 25 years, I've been doing sadhana, mostly repeating the name of Krishna. Up till fairly recently, I was managing 50,000 repetitions a day. I also used to read a lot of spiritual literature. Then Rama, Sita, Lakshman, and Hanuman appeared before me. After they left, I couldn't carry on with my practice. I can't repeat the name anymore. I can't read my books. I can't meditate. I feel very quiet inside, but there is no longer any desire in me to put my attention on God. In fact, I can't even do it if I try. My mind refuses to engage itself in thoughts of God. What has happened to me and what should I do next? The Maharshi looked at me and asked, how did you come here from Madras? I didn't see the point of his question, but I politely told him the answer, by train. And what happened when you got to the station at Tiruvannamalai, he inquired. Well, I got off the train, handed in my ticket, engaged a bullock cart, which took me to the ashram. And when you reached the ashram and paid off the driver of the cart, what happened to the cart? Well, it went away, presumably back to town, I said, still not clear as to where this line of questioning was leading. The Maharshi then explained what he was driving at. The train brought you to your destination. You got off it because you didn't need it anymore. It had brought you to the place you wanted to reach. Likewise with the bullock cart, you got off it when it had brought you to Ramanashram. You don't need either the train or the cart anymore. They were the means for bringing you here. Now you are here, they have no use to you. This is exactly what happened with your sadhana. Your japa, your reading, your meditation have brought you to your spiritual destination. You don't need them anymore. You yourself did not give up your practices. They left you of their own accord because they had served their purpose. You have arrived. Then he looked at me intently. I could feel that my whole body and mind were being washed with waves of purity. They were being purified by his silent gaze. I could feel him looking intently into my heart. Under that spellbinding gaze, I felt every atom of my body being purified. It was as if a new body were being created for me. The process of transformation was going on. The old body was dying atom by atom, and a new body was being created in its place. Then suddenly I understood. I knew that this man who had spoken to me was in reality what I already was, what I had always been. There was a sudden impact of recognition as I became aware of the self. I used the word recognition deliberately, because as soon as the experience was revealed to me, I knew unerringly that this was the same state of peace and happiness that I'd been immersed in as a boy in Lahore on the occasion when I'd refused to accept the mango drink. The silent gaze of the Maharshi re-established me in that primal state, but this time it was permanent. The eye, which had for so long been looking for a God outside of itself, because it wanted to go back to that original childhood state, perished in the direct knowledge and experience of the self, which the Maharshi revealed to me. I cannot describe exactly what the experience was or is, because the books are right when they say that words cannot convey it. I can only talk about peripheral things. I can say that every cell, every atom in my body leapt to attention as they all recognized and experienced the self that animated and supported them. But the experience itself I cannot describe. I knew that my spiritual quest had definitely ended, but the source of that knowledge will always remain indescribable. I got up and prostrated to the Maharshi in gratitude. I had finally understood what his teachings were and are. He had told me not to be attached to any personal God because all forms are perishable. He could see that my chief impediments were God's beautiful form and the love I felt towards him. He had advised me to ignore the appearances of these ephemeral gods and to inquire instead into the nature and source of the one who wanted to see them. He had tried to point me towards what was real and permanent, but stupidly and arrogantly I paid no attention to his advice. With hindsight, I could now see that the question, who am I, was the one question which I should have asked myself years before. I'd had a direct experience of the self when I was small and had spent the rest of my life trying to return to it. My mother had convinced me that devotion to Krishna would bring it back and had somehow brainwashed me into undertaking a quest for an external God whom she said could supply me with that one experience which I desired so much. In a lifetime of seeking, I'd met hundreds of sadhus, swamis, and gurus, but none of them had told me the simple truth the way Maharshi had done. None of them had said, God is within you. He is not apart from you. You alone are God. If you find the source of the mind by asking yourself, who am I? You will experience him in your heart as your own self. If I'd met the Maharshi earlier in my life, listened to his teachings and put them into practice, I could have probably saved myself years and years of fruitless external searching. Yeah. So back to Papaji. Years later, after he retired, he read the works of several famous Bhaktas in the Indian spiritual tradition. He read the poetry of Tukaram and Mirabai. He showed me some of these verses. And he said, as I read them, I recognized in these people the same addiction to name and form, the same hunger for the bliss of experiencing God in a form. All of these people were worshipping a form, holding on to the name, and all of them came to a point where they were addicted to an external form and the bliss that comes from addiction to these external forms. And he said, in reading the poetry of all of these saints, he said, there's normally one verse, there's normally one line when very regretfully they move away from their addiction to the form and they go back to the formless and they find their final resting place in the formless. They find it really, really hard to tear themselves away from the bliss, but ultimately they all come to the same conclusion that the final highest state is not the bliss that you get from form, it's the permanent self-abiding state that you get from immersing yourself in the formless and remaining there. Now, earlier on, has my paper gone? I read out something from Namdev. None can realize the name of God by practice, knowledge, meditation, or austerity. Surrender yourself first at the feet of the Guru and learn to know that I myself is that name. So here is what I think is the missing ingredient for people who do a lot of mantras, they do a lot of japa. It can get you to a place where you completely cleaned your mind out. You've got yourself to a state of absolute inner silence. You have no desires, no vasanas. Nothing moves your mind to extrovert it in any direction except the form or the name of God. And doing that is an immensely cleaning, purifying process. It gets you to a point where you physically can't say the name of God anymore, as what happened with Papaji, but that's not it. Papaji didn't realize the self in his house in Chennai. He got to a state of thought-free awareness, wondering why he couldn't chant anymore. What he needed was to go to Tiruvannamalai, as Namdev said, surrender himself to the feet of the Guru, to explain to the Guru what his problem was, to feel the Guru's grace, to listen to his final Upadesha, to have Bhagavan's look pierce his inner self and put him in that state and give him that recognition that this is who you really are. You've known it all your life. I'm just pushing you back to this place where you've always been. Now go to that place, stay there, and don't waste your time running around looking for visions of me anymore. I will tie this to my favorite quote that Bhagavan gave on surrender. He said, surrender is not to an external form. Somebody asked him to define surrender once, and he said, surrender is to give oneself up to the original source of one's being. That source is within you. So this is what people such as Papaji, Lakshmana Swami are doing. They spend a huge amount of time and energy repeating the name of a god or a guru that has a purificatory function, but then they still need to go to the Guru, they still need to sit in the presence, they still need the Guru to look at them, they still need to have this final act of surrender. You need to lay out your story to Bhagavan, to whoever your teacher is, and say, I've done what I can, I've made my mind completely desire-free, it's pure, now I hand it over to you. And at that point, Bhagavan will eat and consume your mind. There's a lovely verse in Guru Vajka Kovai. I couldn't remember exactly where it was, but maybe it's Padmale, maybe that's why I couldn't find it. It said, Bhagavan alone eats with relish the minds of those who've purified themselves to extinction. There's this notion that our minds are what we put on Bhagavan's plate. We want him to eat our minds, but most of the time we put stuff on our plates and he holds his nose and says, no, I'm not eating that, that's disgusting. But when we put an absolutely purified mind on his plate, then it's so appetizing, so tasty, he has no option but to pick it up and swallow it, and that's the end of us. We're in the same state as him. Plenty of time. So there's one other devotee, and this is Matru Sri Sauda. Her story integrates very well with the theme I've been telling tonight. She also did a lot of japa. So for those who are not familiar with her, I will give a brief recap of what happened to her. She was a young teenager in southern Andhra Pradesh and came to Lakshmana Swami's ashram. I think she was about 13, just became besotted with his name and form. I can't imagine a better destiny than to have, I mean, some teenagers, they fall in love with Justin Bieber. She had the good fortune to fall in love with Inyani and think about him every minute of her waking life. I mean, what a great destiny that is, to have nothing else in your mind but the name and form of Inyani. He tried to make her do self-inquiry. She wasn't the least bit interested in self-inquiry. All she wanted to do was stare at his picture, repeat his name. This practice became so all-consuming for her. She told me that in the final stages of her sadhana, she was either looking at his picture or repeating his name 20 hours a day, and then she would go to sleep for 4 hours. And in the 4 hours that she was technically sleeping, she was dreaming about him so strongly that she said that Lakshmana Swami couldn't sleep, that the devotional force of her devotion to him was so strong. He told me she would wake me up at 3 o'clock in the morning simply by the power of her dreams or the power of her japa. He said for the final year of her sadhana in my ashram, he said I didn't get a good night's sleep because every few minutes I'd be jolted into wakefulness by the intense power of her devotion to my name and form. So when people tell me they're on the path of love, devotion and surrender and they think they're doing really well, I pull this story out and I said, when you can wake your guru up at 3 o'clock in the morning by the power of your devotion, then you're on the right path. Until you can do that, you've still got a long way to go. So there was a climactic episode. So exactly like Papaji. So she was repeating the name, concentrating on the form. And then after about 2 or 3 years of this, she started going into samadhi state. She said, I couldn't focus on his form anymore. My lips wouldn't say his name. I couldn't look at his picture. There was just a natural pulling in to the self. I didn't know what self was in those days, but there was a kind of introversion in which my mind would just get pulled in. I couldn't articulate any thoughts that mentioned his name. I couldn't focus on a picture of him. So I would just rest in these completely thought-free samadhi states. She said I'd be generally aware of what was going on around me, but the bliss, the intensity of these states was very, very strong, and nothing in me was reaching out to worship the picture, repeat his name. All that came to a halt. It all got burned out. And then there was the climactic episode of her sadhana where she went to him. She had a gigantic headache. She said the I thought was afraid of its own death. She said it knew its end was near and it was making a violent attempt to either kill her, fracture her skull, she wasn't sure, but she could feel it banging around inside her head like something that was trying to break the skull and escape. She went up to Lakshmana Swami, she put her head on his feet, held his feet on her head, and he and she said that in that moment, the I thought went back to its source, died, and never rose again. So here again, we have the same trajectory. We have a young woman who absolutely in love with a particular form of the deity, who picked a japa, a form of the god to repeat the name of, who was obsessed with the form to the extent when she was chanting it 20 hours a day, dreaming of him at night, it burned itself out. She approached the guru, put her head on his feet, and that was it. She had purified her mind to the extent where the power of the self acting through the guru was sufficient to take her mind back into the heart and kill it definitively. I once asked Lakshmana Swami, I said, you picked her out when she was a very young teenager. She's the only person you've ever picked out like this. What did you see in her that made you decide this was the one person who could succeed? And he said, I searched and searched her mind and I couldn't find a single bad thought in it. And I thought, well, that probably counts out the rest of us. There was an amazing purity to her when she arrived. She maintained and enhanced that purity through her love, her surrender, and her devotion. And in her final act of surrender, she put her head on his feet and realize the self when the power of the external and the inner guru combine to take her mind back to the source and destroy it. There's one other quote I want to throw in from Bhagavan on this, and I think it's in Maharshi's Gospel. It's not as explicit as I'm going to say it right now, but this is my interpretation of it. Bhagavan says that japa works when you have love and devotion to the form whose name you're repeating. So if you simply repeat a mantra without the love, without the devotion, it has the opposite effect. It actually makes your mind stronger. It's an act of concentration, not an act of devotion. But if you can actually feel love for the name that you're repeating, for the name that appears in your mantra, then that love actually dissolves the mind rather than making it stronger. If the love is not there, I think this was possibly Ganapati Muni's problem. We started off with his story. He said, I've been doing crores and crores of mantras, but they don't seem to be working. If you can do as many mantras as you like, you can develop a massive power of concentration. You can use that concentration to achieve goals in the world. But what really makes the mind disappear is having this absolute love and devotion to the name of the form that you're repeating. If the love and the devotion isn't there, then it's not going to work. So that was my long riff on one of the questions. Apologies if I consume far too much time. There is one question which is more or less on the same topic. Where's it gone? Occasionally during a satsang with Sanjay or when in a deeply contemplative state, certain sacred images arrive. I feel a matching or pairing with them and feel deeply touched and my heart sings. Can you comment, please? Well, that's what I've been talking about for the last 45 minutes, that you can resonate with an image of God. You can feel the bliss. If your devotion is intense enough, then God will appear to you in a form. But as Bhagavan says, contemplation on a form will produce a form that will give you happiness. You might get a vision, you might get the bliss, but that concentration in and of itself isn't going to give you realization. For that, the one who sees the form, the one who experiences the bliss, has to turn back in on itself and go back to its source. Now, another question says, and this is also slightly related, can one attain self-realization solely through self-inquiry without devotion to a guru? I would say that taking the eye back to its source through inquiry is devotion. It is surrender to the inner guru. If you purify the eye to the extent that it doesn't want to go anywhere else except back to its source, that subsided eye is an offering to the inner guru. That's your devotion to the guru. You show your devotion by humbling yourself before the self, by making your eye go back to the self. Bhagavan said that grace is necessary, inquiry is necessary, they complement each other. In my opinion, devotion to the guru is following his teachings, not, how shall we say, not thinking that you know better than the guru, listening to what the guru has to say, putting his instructions into practice, having faith that Bhagavan knows what he's talking about, and that if you have faith that he knows what he's talking about, and you put your commitment into doing the practice, then his grace is there. Your devotion to him comes about through practicing his teaching, not necessarily through any particular practice that you perform by repeating a name or worshipping an external form. There's another question that says, how can you tell if somebody is a jnani? Basically, you can't. That's what we used to call the $64,000 question. Bhagavan was asked about this, and he said that there are two indicators. One of them is the peace you feel in the proximity. and the second is the equality with which the Guru treats all the beings in his proximity. So Bhagavan wasn't saying that this is a guaranteed test. He was saying, look for these two properties. Does your mind slow down or stop when you're in his presence or her presence? And look around. Is that person practicing equality to all the beings around them? If there's a tick for both boxes, then you can take those as good indicators, but you can't take them as proofs. So long as you have a mind, you cannot tell who doesn't have a mind. That there's something in the mind that prevents you from recognizing jnana in somebody else. You can sense emanations of it by the piece that comes off. But if you yourself lose your mind completely, if you get to that state that Bhagavan calls mananasya, the destroyed mind, then apparently it's very easy. I spoke to Lakshmana Swami once. He said that if you don't have a mind, if your mind is dead and you're walking down the street, he said somebody on the other side of the road in that state, you wouldn't need to talk to them, glance at them. You would just recognize there's somebody who's in that state. We don't have that faculty. We don't have that ability. We can have faith that somebody is in that state because we feel peaceful around them and because their behavior is egalitarian, but there's nothing that we can do to give a proper definitive proof of who is or who isn't in that state. We're coming up to close to an hour now, so I'll stop on my questions. If Dr. Sanjay has anything else he wants to ask, we can go through our questions together.
I think people are really enjoying what you are talking about, and if you want to go ahead with the questions, what you have, you're very much welcome to continue with the questions. I think we can extend for next 30 minutes. We can end.
I've been rushing through my questions to finish in time. Okay, the next one is, how do you earn the grace of the Guru? That was on the question. I'm always reminded of Kanji Swami's situation. Kanji Swami was Bhagavan's attendant for 12 years. And at the end of 12 years, he felt a little bit guilty. He felt he should be meditating more. The job of the attendant was quite time consuming. You spent your time standing next to Bhagavan's sofa, dealing with all the visitors, collecting all the offerings, chasing the monkeys out, sorting out the books in the library. It wasn't a sit quietly in meditation. You had to be on your toes. Bhagavan was a very strict taskmaster. He was always reprimanding his attendant for lack of attentiveness or not dealing with people or animals properly. So it did require a very intense concentration, to the extent that you probably thought, well, I can't meditate. I've got to be so alert. I've got to watch Bhagavan so attentively to make sure anything he wants gets given to him. I don't have the time to meditate. So finally, he summoned up the courage and said to Bhagavan, I've been doing this for 12 years. I now feel I've benefited immensely from it. I now feel that I should go off and meditate in Palakatu. I want to put your teachings into practice. So remember, this is probably the job that everybody in the ashram wanted, to be able to stand next to Bhagavan all day, to have personal contact with him all day. The attendants on the whole were the only people who were allowed to go for his morning and evening walks on the hill or to Palakatu. That they really were in pole position. They had the job that everybody else coveted. So when you voluntarily wanted to give them up, there was probably other people would be surprised, and you might feel a little bit guilty that you were giving up the opportunity to spend time in Bhagavan's presence. So with some trepidation, he went to Bhagavan and said, I've been doing this job for years. Now I feel it's time to sit quietly and try and put some of these teachings into practice, to experience them. And Bhagavan was delighted. He said, serving the Guru doesn't mean collecting offerings. It doesn't mean dusting his sheet every morning before he sits down on it. So serving the Guru means listening to his teachings, understanding them, and then putting them into practice. This is the classic hearing, reflection, experience trinity of Vedanta. He said, go off to Palakottu, do your meditation. You serve the Guru by listening to his teachings and by putting his teachings into practice. So that's a preamble. The question is, how is the grace of the Guru earned? I would say, that Bhagavan would say, that if you listen to my teachings, if you consider them, if you convince yourself that they're true, and then you make a serious and continuous effort to put them into practice, then you are earning the grace of the Guru. You don't do it by performing little menial tasks, by standing next to him, by reading the books. You find out the essence of what he has to say, and then you go off and you do your utmost to get the experience that he's talking about. So grace is there all the time, but in my understanding of what Bhagavan was saying, you get it by putting the maximum amount of effort and attention into implementing what Bhagavan is telling you morning, noon, and night about the nature of the I, how it rises, how you deal with it, how you make it go back to the self and disappear. And that leads on to another of the question, which says, why do some people spend years practicing self-inquiry and never realize the self? Lots of people complain about lack of progress in themselves, in other people. First of all, it's not a level playing field. We all come to our current incarnation with zero knowledge of what went on last time. We're not 8 runners on the starting line of the Olympic 100-meter final, or all lined up in the same place, all equally trained, all equally fast. Some of us have a past history of spiritual practice, and some of us don't. Bhagavan himself, after giving a very complicated philosophical explanation of a technical point from a Sanskrit text, paused and said, thank goodness my purva vasanas, my purva samskaras took me straight to self-inquiry in this life. Otherwise, I might have got caught up in all these Sanskrit texts. So Bhagavan very, very rarely admitted to any knowledge of his previous life. That this was one of the rare, when he dropped his guard very, very briefly. I think he was enjoying himself going through a Sanskrit text, pointing out its meaning. And then he paused and he said, he confessed more or less indirectly that whatever he'd done in his past life, he'd probably done a lot of Sanskrit philosophy, he'd enjoyed it, but by far the stronger vasana was towards vichara. So much so that he was born into the right circumstances, had a fascination, devotional impulse towards Arunachala, which kept him quiet when he was a boy, but at the right age, something inside him compelled him to say, what is the nature of the I inside me? And asking that question once, he got the right answer. So it's not a level playing field. Some people like Bhagavan have quite clearly got to the point where asking the question once will produce the right answer. Other people have not. So it's not lack of effort. I think we simply don't see the backstory. Some people might have 10 lifetimes of hard practice and self-inquiry, and as a 16-year-old, they lie on the floor and they get it. Other people might do 4 decades of quite intense practice, but they haven't got the background, they haven't purified themselves to the extent that someone like Bhagavan did. So they're still a work in progress. A moment will come when the I will stop being interested in things other than itself. That this is the tipping point, the fulcrum of the seesaw, if you like, when the I still wants to look outside of itself for entertainment, for enjoyment, for pleasure, then that's where it's going to go. The I, it's like water flowing downhill. The I always moves towards the things it most enjoys, the things it wants to experience, the things it thinks will give it the most happiness. When you practice discrimination, detachment, you start going back to the self more and more through inquiry or through devotion. There comes a kind of a realization understanding, not a realization enlightenment, you suddenly start to appreciate the fact that there's a bit more peace inside, rather than moving outwards all the time to catch hold of objects. And at that point, you take pleasure in moving back towards the self, towards your own peace, towards your own silence. And if you find your mind straying outwards again, you just say, no, I'm not interested in that. I've done that. I've done that all this life and probably all the lifetimes before me, that there's nothing out there that's going to gratify me long term. So you stop giving energy to all the things that you've learned from experience are not going to help you, not going to benefit you. You become like the diabetic in the cake shop. You might stand on the street outside the cake shop and you look and you think, and you might even salivate a bit, but you know if you go in that store and buy something and eat it, you're in big trouble. So that this point comes where you recognize that a rising I is going to connect with things that are just going to cause you suffering and trouble. You learn to say no to them. And in the act of saying no, you lessen the emotional intensity of all these things which are dangling in front of you as potentially desirable objects. And bit by bit, you say, no, not today, thank you. You're like the person saying no to the traveling salesman. You're like the person who's stuffed at the end of the meal, saying no to the waiter. No, I'm not going to eat anymore. I don't need any of that. And any more stuff from you will just make me sick. So you realize something inside that gives you the peace, that gives you the quiet, that gives you the silence. And that's when the seesaw starts to tip, if you like. From that time on, the mind will still go out once in a while, but you say, no, I'm not going there. That's just trouble. And you go back to rest in the self again. So this is the truncated view, the truncated, shortened version of lifetimes of inquiry. You just keep saying no to all the things that the mind wants you to play with. And you start saying yes to the states of peace, quiet, and happiness inside yourself. And finally, you get to this place where you can rest in that silence, you can rest in that peace, and you have the determination, the discrimination not to go out and grab hold of things anymore. And that's when the inquiry really becomes effective. You can see the nature of the rising I. You can see how its characteristic, its habit is to look for something to engage in, look for something to occupy itself with, look for anything that will take its attention off itself. You learn to see this, you learn to recognize it, you learn to see at the core of all your outwardly rising desires. You see this I inside yourself, and instead of allowing it to connect to all the various things it's trying to tempt you with, you just say, no, thank you, not today, and you let it sink back into its source. And the more it does that, the more it becomes satisfied with that source, the less inclined it will be next time to jump out and grab an object. It's like training your puppy, not to pee on your carpet. It takes a lot of conditioning. You keep throwing it out, you keep rubbing its nose in it, but sooner or later, the puppy behaves. The mind is just your puppy. Stop, train it, train it to do the right things in the right places, and sooner or later you find yourself dwelling in that peace, in that silence. And that's the point. This is when I talked about Bhagavan saying, these are the minds that I eat with relish. If you want to serve a mind to Bhagavan as a tasty offering, serve him a mind which no longer has any interest in extroverting, which no longer has any interest in connecting with anything other than the I, which is its own nature. At that point, Bhagavan will look at that I, he'll salivate, he'll eat it up, and you'll be gone forever. So the reason why people spend years practicing self-inquiry and not getting realized is because it's a long, slow process. If you haven't put in the time, the years, even the lifetimes of effort, it's going to be continuous hard work with, I would say, not many obvious practical milestones that you've passed. It's not like you don't accumulate gold stars for milestones along the way. You can be doing your inquiry after 1 year, 10 years, 20 years, and you can feel just as inept and mind busy as you were on day one. But there is slowly, there's a progression back to fewer and fewer thoughts. And as I said, at some point, you find that the fulcrum switches and that mind wants to start going back to enjoy the interior bliss rather than the exterior fun. And at that point, that's when the inquiry starts to work. So that's all I have to say for now.
Thank you, David, for your such an insightful talk. Personally, I don't have any questions, but given that we talked about self, we talked about spirituality, japa, and other ways by which we can abide in self. I just want to ask you, because you have read everything about Bhagwan and you have written so many books. Can you point some lighter moments with Bhagwan when people were able to joke with Bhagwan, or Bhagwan actually did a joke in a lighter way, in a lighter moment? Like I remember, I think Major Chadwick did once, he was fanning him and then he was hiding, and then the Bhagwan didn't know where the wind is coming from or where the air is coming from. And like it was a lighter moment. Do you remember some of these lighter moments with Bhagwan?
I think there are many. I think we tend to see him as a rather kindly kind of grandfather figure sitting on his sofa. We feel that we would have a good relationship with him. But I've talked to many people who went there, and they said there was something almost terrifyingly unapproachable about Bhagavan, that people, some were shy, of course, but just he inspired such awe amongst the people around him that it wasn't really, for most of the time, the kind of situation where there'd be much levity. He would make jokes. He'd tell stories from the Puranas. He'd tell stories about his childhood, for example, all the various antics he got up with. He was a great actor. He could play the roles of all the characters in the story, and everybody would be laughing. But I think a lot of people found it really, really hard to interact with him in a normal way. People felt they were in the presence of God, and somehow it felt a bit flippant to start making jokes to God. And that was the feeling I got from many, many people. Some people had a childlike relationship with him. I think we were all a bit jealous of those. I think Devaraja Mudalia always treated him as a kind of father or grandfather figure he could run to with all his stories. G.V. Subramaya was the same. They had very normal, jokey, friendly interactions. But I think for the vast majority of people, he was this god on the sofa, and they found it very, very hard to do anything except stammer when they went anywhere near him. I mean, I would just tell you one story because I like it. Muruganar was, I think, what nowadays we would just diagnose as obsessive compulsive. He couldn't stop washing his hands before his meals. A lady who looked after his meals in the 1950s said she had to walk and fetch 2 buckets of water before his meal. This isn't to wash his hands afterwards. He needed 2 buckets of water just to wash his hands before he even ate, and then another couple of buckets afterwards. He was always scrubbing and cleaning and polishing himself. So Bhagavan gave him the job of looking after the lingam in the mother's temple. This is the 1920s when it was still a thatched hut. Muruganar took his obsessive compulsive behavior into the mother's shrine and spent the whole morning scrubbing the lingam with the cloth. He was never finished. He just spent the whole time white, clean. He was never satisfied with it. And in the end, Bhagavan laughed and said, you're sacked. If we carry on with you in this job, there won't be any lingam left in 3 weeks. You'll have rubbed it all away. So there were instances like this. They could make fun with each other. I think Muruganar was another person who could have friendly interactions with Bhagavan. he once wrote a verse, not say complaining, but poking fun of Bhagavan's obsession in the kitchen with not wasting things, cooking in a very accurate way, a bit of a control freak. Everything had to be done his way. Every mustard seed had to be accounted for. And Muruganar wrote a verse. Muruganar expressed himself in little verses rather than verbal complaints, saying, why with habits like this don't you find yourself a nice girl and settle down? You're more obsessed with cooking and cleaning than any woman I've ever met. Why don't you find yourself a nice girl and settle down with her? And Bhagavan roared with laughter when he read this and said, no woman would have me. They wouldn't put up with my behavior in the kitchen. So if you're in the kind of mood where your devotion, the kind of devotion you had was a kind of child-parent one, then you could laugh and joke with Bhagavan. But I think for the vast majority of people, it wasn't the case. I will tell you one story. It's just jumped into my head. I was sitting at my desk in Tiruvannamalai, and the phone rang. And it was a woman I'd never spoken to before. Normally I don't pick up numbers I don't know, but I picked it up. And it said, "Are you Mr. Godman?" I said, "Yes." And she said, "Oh, a friend of mine who's a professor in the US suggested I call you and tell you this story." And the mutual friend was someone I knew. So I said, "Okay, what's your story?" And she said, I was a little girl at Ramanashram in the 1940s. I was brought up there, my family lived there. So after a few inquiries, I realized that I was talking to one of Mr. Bose's daughters. He was the Calcutta engineer who built a big compound close to Ramanashram. And she said, I used to go to Ramanashram, and my father had impressed on me how great, how powerful Bhagavan was. And he compared him to God and said, like God, Bhagavan can give you anything you want. He was a bit of hyperbole. He said, just go and ask Bhagavan and he'll give you anything you want. He's so great, he's greater than God. So she said, as a young child, I thought, great, now's my chance to get some free stuff. So I walked into the hall, and she said, I can't actually remember what I wanted, but it was something so outrageous, huge, and unattainable, something that Bhagavan couldn't possibly supply, that he just laughed and he said, no, I'm sorry, I can't give you that, but let's go for a walk instead. So Bhagavan got off his sofa and took this, I think she was about 5 or 6 years old, and took her by the hand and gave her a private walk for about half an hour on the lower slopes of Arunachala. And I'm thinking, wow, what a great destiny that was to have, at 5 or 6 years old, to have Bhagavan take you by the hand. First of all, he didn't like people touching him. I think children were okay, sometimes old devotees, but to have Bhagavan invite you out for a walk, hold your hand, give you a personal tour of Arunachala, and then take you back and hand you over to your parents. So she said that's my abiding memory of Bhagavan, of walking in, asking for something so completely outrageous, even Bhagavan laughed. And as compensation for not being able to supply it, he said, let's go for a walk. And he took me for a private guided tour of Arunachala. So there are not many people left in the world who can tell me a story about Bhagavan who is still alive. So it's just wonderful to sit at your desk in the morning and have a random stranger call you up and tell you a story like this.
Thank you, David, for your all beautiful stories and anecdotes and about the teachings and clarifying people's doubts about the teachings. I think you have covered almost all the questions. I have no questions with me. I passed on everything to you, and I think you have taken up the most important questions, and I believe everyone has been enlightened by your answers. So thank you very much, and thank you on behalf of Bhagwan Maharishi Melbourne Kendra. and hope we will have more satsangs with you. Thank you very much to be here.
Very, very enjoyable. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. And would it be possible for you to come over here one day?
Post-COVID,
Yes.
I don't want. I've already done one 2-week quarantine here. I don't want to do another one.
Yeah.